Hello everyone. So in this video, we'll talk about Parmenides' way of truth or of aletheia, which is basically covered in fragment 8, which we have, it's a very long fragment with about, I think we have 60 lines. It took me some time to try and translate it. I will not be reading from my translation this time because it's a bit doubtful. So 49, lines. It felt like much longer. I thought it was 61 lines that I translated. Anyway, in this fragment, he gives a kind of derivation for the attributes of being. And he gives these 4 deductions, deductions for different properties of this being. And so in this video, we'll discuss these 4 sort of deductions and the properties that he comes up with, and what we can understand, what understanding we can get from it. So we talked about it last time, in which we talked about the way of being of esthi of Parmenides, and we said for Parmenides, this esthi, if you take it a bit tautologically, like the subject of esthi, so it's like what is, the subject of esthi is esthi itself, and he says it cannot not be, it is impossible for it to not be. And if it is impossible for it to not be, then there can be no birth, there can be no genesis, there can be no sort of, because for something to be born, it has to come into being, but for coming into being, then it means that at one point it was not, right? Earlier it was not and now it is, but what is not is not. So how can something that comes into being now come from something that is not? Right, another time than it is. So that would be the path of the mortals that the goddess has banned us from, also that it is at one time, one at the same time, it is there and not there, sort of a thing, or rather at one time it was not and now it is. So this temporality is also a problem. And so this palinthropos that we talked about last time was this, this way of the mortals, where whenever we think of something being born, of genesis, of birth, we are thinking in a palinthropic way, is what Parmenides would say, because what is going on is that we are passing back and forth between being and non-being. We are saying that, oh, it was non-being, and from non-being it became being, and then perishing would be, and it goes back into non-being, and what Parmenides is saying is that what is not, and what is. So how can you have this? So he says, so that's why don't trust the senses, but judge by reason, by logos, really. There's this logos that we talked about a lot in Heraclitus. So judge by this logos, because senses deceive, and it's only reason that you can trust. Only reason can be trusted. And in that sense, he was an idealist. And we can see, this idealism of Parmenides, in which he's breaking from materialism, in which he's saying that, what is the true reality? This true reality is not to be heard, to be seen, to be felt, to be tasted, not with this aimless eye and and ringing ear, wandering eye, ringing ear, plying aimlessly along this road. Rather, think, infer, use your reason, use your thought, use a well-persuaded argument, use a persuasive argument to understand, which was the end of the last fragment that we talked about. So yeah, let's talk in sections now. So the only true way, we are talking about the true way, in which first it is eternal, it does not come into being, nor does it perish, right? So fragment 8, it begins, and I'll start with my translation, then I'll move on to another one. So only one story of the way is still left, right? There's only one story of the way still left, that is being. On it, there are very many signs that, since it is, being is uncreated and imperishable, whole, unique, motionless, and complete. Yeah? It neither was nor will be, because it is now altogether one and continuous. Yeah? So you have this idea of being something that is, and he will give derivations, he'll give like sort of deductions for each of these things. That's why I said it's like the poem is like a theorem out here, where being is uncreated, imperishable, whole, unique, motionless, complete. Yeah? It neither was nor will be. Why? Because it is now all together. Right? So the first one that he gives, the first deduction, is between this ageneton and anoletron. So, the idea of it being uncreated and imperishable. So we'll discuss that first deduction first, where, yeah. So he says, wait, I'm trying to find this. Oh yeah, it's on this page, sorry. So, uncreated, imperishable. So what origin will you seek for it, he asks. How and whence did it grow? I will not allow you to speak or to think as having come from what is not, for it is neither spoken nor thought that it is not. And what obligation would have stirred it into being, later or earlier, from not having begun to grow? That is why it must either fully be or not be. Yeah, so that's the first deduction for the fact that it is uncreated and imperishable, right? It doesn't come into being, it doesn't perish, right? So what he's saying is that it is what kind of origin, he asks, can you seek for it, right? Where did it come from? Where did it grow from? We already talked about it, in the beginning of this video, where we said that for it to come into being in the first place, it would have to have come from non-being. But if it was not, how did it come into, if it was not, then it was not. And there's nothing can come from what is not, because what is not is not. It is impossible, and it is impossible for it to be. So he says that, how can you think or say, remember there are these two words again, that it grew from what is not? Because, what is not cannot be thought of, cannot be said. You cannot even think or say that it is not, even that you can't say. And so how could it sort of have come from that? How could it have grown in the first place? What could have prompted it to come to be now? Like, how could it have come to be now rather than later, sooner rather than later? How could you have this idea that, oh, suddenly it decides to spring from non-being? First of all, non-being is not. And second, is there any reason for it to spring at this time and not at another time, if there is time in the first place? And beginning from nothing, really, if there's nothing, this ex nihilo genesis, he doesn't approve of this genesis from nothing. He doesn't like at all, and he says that, well, it's impossible, really, right? What could have stirred it, he says, to sort of come now or later, earlier rather than later. And that's why he says it must either fully be or not be. It either is there completely or it is not there at all. Yeah. So the idea that it has to be fully or it has to be not at all. Yeah. So that's the first deduction of the Singh. The second deduction is Ulon monogenes, so it is whole and one of its kind, right? So this is the second derivation, where he says, and this is line 22 to 25. Oh yeah, sorry. Before we go to the second deduction, in fact, first deduction, there's a bit more left. So he says, and now I should really move from my translation to another. Use this one, which is a verse translation, which I prefer. So line 12 of fragment 8. Yeah. So, nor ever from not being will the force of conviction allow something to come or to be beyond it. On account of this, neither to be born nor to die has justice allowed it, having loosed its bonds, but she holds it fast. And the decision about these matters lies in this: it is or it is not. But it has in fact been decided, just as is necessary, to leave the one unthought and nameless, for no true way it is it, and that the one that it is indeed is genuine. Right? And how could what is be hereafter, and how might it have been? For if it was, it is not, nor if ever it is going to be. Thus generation is extinguished and destruction unheard of. Yeah. In fact, let's just discuss this in this video, and I'll make a second video for the second deduction, because this can get fairly complicated. So basically, what he's saying is that it must fully be or not be, as we discussed earlier. And then he says that, like if you look at evidence, if you look at the evidence of things, then anything apart from being cannot come out from being, in fact, cannot come out from what is not, is what he says. Nor will the force of evidence, suffer anything beside itself to sort of arise from what is not. And then he uses this again. This decay comes back, this justice, and she does not relax her fetters and allow for it to come into being or perish, right? So justice sort of says, no, you cannot sort of come into being and perish. You fully are or you are not, but holds it fast. And so the verdict, as Parmenides says, lies in this, that it is or it is not, to be or not to be, right? Either it is or it is not. And what he says is that, but this has already been decided, right? This verdict has already been given, this has already been decided, that you have to, and remember, like in the previous video we talked about, you have to leave that one path untouched, like I bar you, Goddess says, from that path, where they talk about what is not, right? It is unthinkable, it is unnameable, it's not the true path, it's a false path. And so there is only one path that is left, and that is the path of being. So how is it that, what could be afterwards, could perish, in the past? And so the idea is that what is cannot go into the future and be destroyed, and what is cannot have come from the past where it was not, and in that sense was destroyed, right, or it did not exist. And so he says, and in this way, he says, where was that line? Yeah. For if it was, it is not, nor if it ever is going to be. Thus generation is extinguished and destruction unheard of. Yeah, there is no generation, there is no destruction. Whew, as you can see. So it cannot exist in a future time, it cannot exist in a past time. In fact, what he's also destroying is time. Right? There is no time in this system, because time would mean that there is a past and future, and past was different and the future is different. While if everything is eternally present, as Eliot would say, if all time is eternally present, but like for him, it's all time is unredeemable, we don't go there. In fact, all time is eternally present, which means there is no time, as far as Parmenides is concerned, there is no future time in this. So when he says esti, which is to be, to exist, basically he's saying that it is in that sense eternal, right? It is eternal, and we'll see it as unmoving and continuous, which is the next part, where it did not come into being, it will not go out of being, it always existed, it will continue to exist, and and in fact, the word of continuity is also like a tricky word, because it's not changing, it is just the same. Yeah, it is always there, right? It has no past, no future. In fact, the idea of past and future are in themselves meaningless, So when we talk of eternality, we have to distinguish it from the idea of everlasting. So with Anaximander, for example, when we said that the apeiron was everlasting, that apeiron existed before, exists now, and exists in the future. That's a different idea from eternality, because in eternality you are abolishing time, you're abolishing change, you're abolishing past, future, present, all these. In fact, everything is eternally present. Everything is here and now, forever. And if you remember that fragment that we read, I forgot which one it was now, where it is immediately present to you. Anything that you can think of far away, because being clings on to being, that was a fragment. So it is eternally present to you. So in that sense, the idea of past and future are meaningless. Everything is eternally present. And in that sense, nothing could have come from the past into the present. There's no coming into being. Nothing is going from the present into the future. There's no perishing or change, right? Because anything, and the summary, I'll just give you the summary, because if you've gotten confused with all the discussion so far, is that, let's say if something comes into being, there are only two possibilities, right? It will come into being either from what is not, or it will come into being from what is. But if it comes into being from what is, let's say, then it already is, right? So then there is nothing existing that SC that precedes SC, right? There's no SC that precedes SC, which means that it already always is, which means that it cannot come into being from what is. Yeah. Now the other possibility, the earlier one that we talked about, in which it comes into being from what is not, right? But what is not, if you remember, cannot generate anything because it is not. It does not even exist, right? Ex nihilo nihil fit, right? So from nothing, nothing comes at all, which means that it can only be thought of in the present. And that's what I mean by the abolishing of time. Time is abolished because there is no, because there cannot be a past or future at all, right? They cannot, you know, what is, the future cannot come from what is because it already is. It cannot sort of, you know, come from the past because what is not is not. Yeah. So if, you know, we absolutely reject the idea of what is not, right? Then it cannot sort of, as I said, there's no past, there's no future, there's no becoming, there's no perishing, right? There's no generation, there's no destruction, like everything is eternally there present. Yeah. So as I said, it became a long sort of a thing. In fact, I'll give you Aristotle's summary, who gives a very nice summary in which he says, what is does not come into being, for it is already, and nothing could come into being from what is not. Yeah. So the summary that I gave, slightly longer, shorter, succinct version of this from Aristotle. What is does not come into being, for it is already, it already exists, and nothing could come into being from what is not. Yeah. So which is why, the first deduction of Parmenides is done. This is how, rather. Yeah. All right. Thank you. In the next video, next deduction.